Marcus was on his way home, the cold rain drenching the streets under the dim glow of streetlights. His coat clung to his shoulders as he hurried down the empty road, head lowered against the storm. Suddenly, a sound cut through the relentless patter of rain, a muffled sob. He stopped, his pulse quickening as he scanned the shadows. There, under a flickering light, sat a young girl with tangled hair, clutching a tiny baby to her chest, both shivering from the cold. Marcus wasn't a man known for stopping. He kept to himself, always choosing quiet and solitude over the chaos of human connection. But this night was different. Something in the girl's eyes, wide, wet, and filled with a fear that went deeper than the chill of the rain, stirred an instinct in him that he hadn't felt in years. The street was eerily still except for the rain's steady drumming and the girl's trembling voice whispering, "Please, help us." This was no ordinary encounter. It was the start of a night that would pull Marcus into a world of secrets, danger, and a truth that no one could have predicted. Marcus wasn't always a solitary figure avoiding connection. His days of loyalty, courage, and brotherhood were deeply etched in his memories, as they were born from his years as a soldier. The war had taken a lot from him: friends, moments of peace, and parts of himself he once thought untouchable. It had taught him to remain on guard, to scan his surroundings, and be ready for anything. Yet, beneath that armor, Marcus still carried an instinct to protect and help others. That instinct was buried deep, but it had never truly disappeared. His military past was marked by countless moments where his quick thinking and deep sense of duty saved lives. There were nights filled with the sound of distant cries, days where split-second decisions were the difference between life and death. The camaraderie and responsibility of watching over his comrades were ingrained in him, even though those days were long gone. After leaving the service, Marcus found it difficult to transition back into a world that moved at a different pace, a world where silence meant safety and trust was given freely. He became more reserved, choosing solitude over the company of others. The years following his military service were quiet but heavy. Marcus worked a steady job, kept his head down, and moved through life as if on autopilot. People in his small town knew him as the man who offered a polite nod but never more. They saw only the surface, a quiet, strong figure with eyes that always seemed to look somewhere far away. Yet behind those eyes was a man carrying stories he'd never shared, and scars, both visible and hidden, that reminded him why he kept his distance. But that night, under the cold rain, everything Marcus had trained himself to suppress rose to the surface. He wasn't just a man passing by anymore, he was a protector once again. His heart, though hardened by years of isolation and loss, recognized the raw vulnerability in the girl's eyes. Memories of wartime, where he'd seen that same look on the faces of displaced families and frightened children, came flooding back. In those moments of chaos, he had moved without hesitation to bring safety and comfort to others, even if it meant risking himself. That instinct now pulled at him, demanding action. The unpredictable nature of his military experiences had trained Marcus to remain calm under pressure. Where others would freeze, he would act, assessing the situation with practiced eyes. This habit now resurfaced as he approached the girl, taking in the shaking of her hands and the frailty of the child in her arms. He was back in that mode of protecting, his senses sharpening and heart pounding, but his expression remained steady. It was as if the years of quiet and distance melted away, leaving only the man he once was, someone who fought to shield others from harm. But the decision to help wasn't only born of training and habit. It was also influenced by regret, a ghost from his past that followed him silently. During the war, there was one mission that haunted Marcus more than any other. A moment when he couldn't reach someone in time, where fate worked against him despite his best efforts. It was the kind of memory that stayed like a splinter in his mind, resurfacing in the lonely hours of the night. The young girl's cry and the helplessness in her voice awakened that memory, and with it, an opportunity, perhaps even a redemption of sorts. Though Marcus had long convinced himself that isolation was safer, that night reminded him why he used to fight and why, deep down, he still wanted to be the man who stepped in when no one else would. As he moved toward the girl, droplets of rain trickling down his face, the past and present collided. He wasn't just Marcus, the quiet town figure anymore. He was Marcus, the soldier, the protector, ready to confront whatever truth awaited. And though he had no idea what that truth might be, the instinct that had once saved others now told him that it was time to act again. Standing in the relentless rain, shivering and soaked to the bone, Ava clutched her baby brother, Leo, tightly to her chest, The cold seeped into her bones, but she barely noticed it. Her mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything that had brought them to this moment. The darkness of the night felt vast and uncaring, but she held her brother closer, as if her embrace could keep the world's dangers at bay. Ava was only 16, but life had forced her to grow up faster than most. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her every day, but she never wavered. Leo, with his innocent, wide eyes and soft coos, was her world. He represented every reason she had to keep going, even when it felt impossible. Their parents, once a source of safety, were now just shadows in her memory. After their sudden disappearance, Ava had taken on the role of caregiver, protector, and everything in between. The house they used to live in was no longer a home. It became a place of fear, ruled by a figure that brought chaos: her uncle, who moved in to look after them when their parents vanished. But looking after them wasn't what he had in mind. His presence was a constant reminder of the danger lurking nearby. Ava learned to walk on eggshells, to anticipate his moods, and to shield Leo from the worst of it. But there were nights, like the one that pushed them into the rain, when her uncle's rage spilled over. That night, it had been different. It had been worse. Ava had felt the shift as soon as the door slammed. The shouts were louder, and the threats sharper. She knew she couldn't stay this time, not with Leo's safety on the line. Grabbing only the blanket that wrapped her brother in the small, worn backpack she kept hidden, she slipped out of the back door while her uncle's voice echoed through the small, cramped house. The rain greeted them like a sudden wall, but Ava didn't hesitate. The chill was nothing compared to what she was leaving behind. As they stood in the downpour, Leo whimpered softly, his little face pressed against her shoulder. The sound tugged at her heart, adding urgency to her need to find shelter. The streets were empty, washed clean by the rain, yet they offered no comfort. Each shadow seemed to hold a threat, each corner a secret waiting to pounce. But Ava kept moving, cradling Leo with one arm while using the other to keep the water out of his face. The love she felt for him was fierce, overwhelming, and more powerful than any fear she had ever known. The bond between Ava and Leo was unbreakable. She remembered the nights when their parents would tuck them into bed, Leo's chubby fingers reaching for her hair as he fell asleep. Even as their world fell apart, Leo's trust in her never wavered. That trust was what fueled Ava now, her feet splashing through puddles as she looked for safety. He deserved more than this. He deserved warmth, laughter, and the kind of life they once had. But until then, he had her, and she would fight through any storm to keep him safe. The rain mingled with tears she didn't even realize were falling, making her face feel colder. Yet there was no time for breaking down. The baby in her arms stirred, his small sigh snapping her back to the moment. As her eyes darted around, searching desperately for a sign of hope, she noticed a figure in the distance, a man, standing as if the rain was of no concern to him. For the first time that night, Ava felt something other than dread. It was tentative and fragile, but it was there, a glimmer of hope. Marcus stood frozen for a moment, watching the girl struggle to shield herself and the baby from the unrelenting rain. His mind raced, torn between instincts that battled within him. Caution told him to stay back. He didn't know her story or the risks involved in stepping in. But another part, deeper and more familiar, pushed him to act. This was the part that remembered what it was like to feel lost and unseen. The part that had once been saved by a stranger's compassion. He clenched his fists, the rain soaking through his coat and sending a chill down his spine. The night air was heavy with an eerie quiet, broken only by the faint whimpers of the child and the steady drumming of rain against the pavement. Marcus's hesitation lasted only seconds, but each moment seemed to stretch. He knew that walking away would haunt him. The image of that small, fragile bundle in the girl's arms would carve itself into his memory, a permanent reminder of what he didn't do. Suddenly, the girl's knees buckled slightly as she readjusted her hold on the baby, the effort evident in her tired, panicked movements. That was at the moment that snapped something inside Marcus. Without another thought, he moved towards them, his steps splashing through the shallow puddles, determination hardening his face. The girl flinched as he approached, eyes wide with fear, but Marcus spoke gently, careful not to startle her. "Hey, it's okay, you're safe. Let me help." The relief in her eyes was immediate, though still shadowed by uncertainty. She nodded hesitantly, too exhausted to argue. Marcus carefully scooped up the baby first, cradling the small, shivering body close to his chest. The warmth of Leo's little form against him brought a rush of protectiveness he hadn't felt in years. As Ava clutched his arm, Marcus steadied her with a reassuring nod and wrapped his other arm around her shoulders. Moving through the rain was a challenge. The cold bit at his exposed skin, and the added weight made each step deliberate and slow. The streets seemed endless, darkened storefronts and glistening asphalt, reflecting the harsh glow of streetlights. He could feel Ava shivering against him, though she didn't make a sound. Her silence spoke volumes. It was the kind of quiet that held stories of fear and resilience. With every step, Marcus's heart beat faster, not just from the physical strain but from the urgency of their situation. He knew the risks of keeping the children in the rain. Hypothermia was a real threat. The baby's breathing was light and quick, and Ava's eyelids fluttered from exhaustion. Marcus pushed forward, fighting the tightness in his chest that came from more than just the cold air. He had to find shelter soon. He glanced down at Leo, whose small fingers twitched unconsciously, then at Ava, whose gaze was fixed ahead, eyes defiant despite her trembling. "We're almost there," Marcus said, more to reassure himself than to them. The words, simple as they were, felt like a promise he had to keep. The faint glow of a cafe down the street sparked hope in him, the thought of warmth and safety giving him the strength to push through the biting wind and pounding rain. As they reached the cafe, Marcus exhaled a shaky breath of relief. The door swung open with a jingle, and the warm air enveloped them, washing away the chill in an instant. The small crowd inside turned to look, their expressions shifting from casual curiosity to alarm. Marcus met their stares with a nod, silently communicating that he had this under control. For now, at least, he had done what needed to be done. The fluorescent lights of the clinic cast a stark glow over the waiting room, their hum blending with the soft rustle of papers and quiet murmur of voices. The space was a mix of hurried energy and silent anticipation, people shifting in plastic chairs as nurses called out names. Marcus stood near the entrance, his clothes still damp and clinging to him, holding Leo close while Ava sat beside him, eyes darting nervously to every person who passed. She gripped the edge of the seat, fingers white with tension. A nurse approached, clipboard in hand, eyes flickering from Marcus to the children. "We'll need to take a look at them right away," she said, her tone professional but tinged with concern. Marcus nodded, stepping back as Ava instinctively reached for his arm. He gently squeezed her hand, an unspoken reassurance that he wouldn't leave. The examination room was small, the sharp scent of antiseptic filling the air. Leo was laid down first, and Marcus watched the doctor's hands move with practiced precision as he checked the baby's pulse and temperature. The room felt too warm now, almost stifling, as the seconds stretched into minutes. Marcus shifted uneasily, every muscle in his body coiled with worry. He glanced at Ava, who sat upright on the examination table, her eyes locked on her brother, face pale but determined. The doctor's expression was serious but not panicked as he looked up. "He's cold and exhausted, but we caught it in time. He'll need fluids and warmth." The relief that swept over Marcus was sudden and overwhelming. The tension in his shoulders loosened, but his mind didn't rest. There were still questions he needed answered: who these children were, and what they had run from. Ava flinched as another nurse moved toward her with a stethoscope. Marcus reached out, placing a comforting hand on her back. "It's all right, they're just making sure you're okay," she nodded but kept her eyes lowered, trust only extending so far. While the nurses worked, Marcus's gaze drifted to the wall clock, its ticking a reminder of the time slipping by. Each tick was a heartbeat, a step closer to uncovering truths he wasn't sure he was prepared for. He felt the pull between protecting them now and the questions that loomed large. Was someone looking for them? Was danger still close? The doctor glanced up after making notes. "You did well bringing them in when you did. It could have been much worse." Marcus's eyes met the doctor's, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. He could feel Ava's eyes on him, searching for signs that everything was truly okay. He forced a small smile and whispered, "You're safe now." As the staff moved in and out, taking calls and tending to other patients, Marcus was left in a quiet pocket of the room, watching Ava trace a line on the blanket covering Leo. There was so much he needed to know, but asking too much now would shatter the fragile trust he'd earned. A commotion outside the room brought him back to reality: a raised voice, quick footsteps. Marcus stiffened, instincts sharpened from years past kicking in. He turned toward the noise, ready for whatever came next. the protective fire within him reigniting. Ava sat on the edge of the bed, her legs tucked underneath her, her arms crossed tightly across her chest, as if she could hold herself together by sheer force. The soft murmur of voices outside the room, the shuffle of nurses and doctors working, all seemed far away to her. She could feel the weight of the room pressing down on her, the air thick with questions she wasn't ready to answer. The lights flickered overhead, and for a moment she could almost hear the storm outside, its rain tapping against the clinic windows. Her mind raced back to the moment they'd arrived at the clinic, the moment Marcus had gently set Leo down on the nearest chair, his concern obvious but his silence comforting. Ava hadn't looked up, not at first, not until the nurses had begun to check on her brother. Now, they were trying to talk to her, to ask about who she was, where she came from, but she couldn't bring herself to speak. Every question felt like a brick she couldn't lift. "Sweetheart," a soft voice broke through her thoughts. One of the nurses who had been caring for Leo. "We just need to know how to help you. If you could tell us what happened, where you came from, we could." Ava's eyes snapped up, her face flushed with panic. I can't," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't tell you anything. You don't understand. They'll find us." Her fingers curled into the blanket, as though it could offer her some protection. The nurse paused, uncertainty flashing in her eyes. "Who will find you, Ava?" she asked gently, taking a small step forward. Ava shook her head, her lips trembling. "No one can know we're here," she stood abruptly, walking to the small window in the corner, peering out through the blinds as if looking for someone who might be watching. She had been on the run for so long, always looking over her shoulder, always one step ahead. The world outside felt like it was closing in on her, suffocating her with every passing second. Marcus, standing at the door, watched her in silence, understanding the gravity of the situation. He wanted to reassure her, to tell her that she was safe now, but he knew better than to press too hard. She wasn't. Not yet. Her voice cracked as she spoke again, low and desperate. "I can't let anything happen to Leo. He's all I have left. Please, don't." "Oh," she cut herself off, the words lodged in her throat. Marcus stepped forward, his presence steadying her. "Ava," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you." But his words were just that, words. They weren't promises she could trust, not yet. Ava didn't respond right away. She just stood there, her body tense, her eyes locked on the floor. Leo's small, fragile form on the bed seemed so innocent in comparison to the storm of fear that swirled inside of her. He didn't understand what was happening, didn't know the danger that still lurked in the shadows. But Ava knew. And that knowledge made her protective, made her unwilling to let go of the one thing she could control. "I can't," she whispered, shaking her head. "I can't trust you. Not yet." The nurse took a step back, glancing at Marcus, who gave her a barely perceptible nod. The tension in the room was palpable, a delicate balance between understanding and the pressing need for answers. Ava's thoughts drifted to the night they had fled, how they had run through the dark streets, the rain drenching them as they pushed forward. They couldn't stop. Not for a second. They couldn't afford to trust anyone, not even the kind stranger who had helped them. Because the people who were after them didn't care who they hurt, didn't care about the truth. They were relentless, and if they found out where Ava and Leo were, they would be in even more danger. Her thoughts spiraled, her protective instinct kicking in with every passing second. "You don't know what it's like," she murmured to herself, her hands trembling. Marcus could see the internal struggle playing out in front of him. She was terrified, caught between the need for help and the overwhelming fear of what might come if she revealed too much. And in that moment, he realized something he hadn't fully understood before. This wasn't just about the rain, or the children, or even the help he had offered. This was about trust. Trust that had been broken time and time again, and the deep scars it left. "I won't hurt you," Marcus said softly, his voice carrying an earnestness that made her look at him for the first time. "You and Leo are safe here, I promise. But you need to tell us what's going on so we can help." Ava's gaze softened just a fraction, and for the briefest moment, he thought she might let go of her fear. But then she swallowed hard and turned away, her shoulders stiff. "Not yet," she whispered. The silence in the room stretched again, but now, there was a fragile thread of hope between them, a tentative understanding. Ava didn't know if she could trust Marcus yet, but there was something about his presence that made her want to. And that was enough for now. As Marcus sat in the clinic, his mind couldn't shake the weight of what Ava had revealed in the brief moments of silence. There was so much she hadn't said, so much that lingered in the air like an unspoken secret. The tension in the room was thick, palpable, as the nurse continued to check on Leo. Ava sat motionless, her eyes unfocused, her thoughts clearly far away. She seemed to be lost in the depths of her own pain, her fingers gripping the hem of her coat like a lifeline. Marcus stood by the door, his heart heavy with the weight of the situation. He tried to offer comfort, to reassure her, but something in her eyes told him that words weren't enough. She was running from something much darker than any storm they'd encountered. And it wasn't just her fear of being found that kept her silent, it was the fear of what might happen to Leo if the truth came out. He thought back to their brief interaction. There was a reason she couldn't trust anyone, a reason she had been so protective of her brother. It wasn't just that she didn't want to be caught, it was that whoever was after them had the power to destroy everything they had left. Suddenly, a soft voice broke through Marcus's thoughts. Ava spoke, her voice barely audible, but the words hit him like a thunderclap. "Our parents," Ava began, her voice trembling as she finally allowed the words to spill out. "They weren't who you think they were. They were involved in something dangerous." Marcus moved closer, not wanting to crowd her but needing to hear more. She looked up at him, her face pale, her eyes haunted. They were mixed up with the wrong people. People who would do anything to protect their secrets. Ava's gaze dropped to Leo, still asleep, unaware of the storm that was brewing around them. "My parents, they knew too much. They had information that could ruin everything." Marcus's heart sank as the pieces began to fall into place. The fear that had clouded Ava's every move, the way she protected Leo, she wasn't just fleeing from some random threat. She was running from a force that had already torn apart her family. Who were they running from? Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper, not wanting to push too hard but needing to understand. Ava's face hardened, her jaw clenching as if the very act of speaking the truth might break her. "I can't tell you who they were," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But they're dangerous, Marcus. And they'll stop at nothing to get us back." Marcus's mind raced, the gravity of her words sinking in. He'd seen his share of dangerous situations during his time in the military. But this was something entirely different. This wasn't a random attack or a fight over resources. This was a threat so deep, so rooted in secrecy, that even the authorities might not be able to help. Ava and Leo weren't just victims, they were part of a much larger, far more dangerous game. Ava wiped at her eyes, the exhaustion and fear catching up to her. She was still the same protective sister, but now, her vulnerability was laid bare for the first time. "If they find us," she whispered, "they'll take Leo. They won't stop until they get him." Marcus's chest tightened. He had to fight the urge to promise her everything would be okay, because he knew it wouldn't be. He wasn't sure how much danger they were truly in, or how deep this went, but he knew one thing for sure: whatever it was bigger than him. Bigger than Ava and Leo. And that made it all the more dangerous. He reached out, placing a hand on Ava's shoulder, offering whatever comfort he could. "I'll help you," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling in his mind. "We'll get through this together." But even as the words left his mouth, Marcus wasn't sure if he truly understood what he was getting into. Whatever secret Ava and Leo were carrying, it was more than just their survival, it was a truth that could shatter everything. Ava looked up at him, her expression softening just a fraction. "You don't know what you're getting into," she whispered. "This isn't just about us anymore, it's about everything." And that's when Marcus realized just how deep this was. They weren't just hiding from people who wanted to hurt them, they were caught in the middle of something far bigger. Something that no one, not even the authorities, could stop. And the only way they would survive was to stay one step ahead, no matter the cost. As Marcus stood there, his hand still gently resting on Ava's shoulder, he felt the weight of the moment settle deeper into his chest. What started as an innocent act of kindness, offering a shelter from the storm to a girl and her little brother, had grown into something far more complicated. He wasn't just helping them anymore, he was stepping into a situation that was beyond anything he could have predicted. Before, Marcus was a man who lived a life of solitude. His military background had taught him to remain detached, to avoid getting too close to anything or anyone. He knew the danger of getting emotionally involved. It clouded judgment, and it was always a risk. But now, as he watched Ava's weary face, filled with concern for her brother and the life they were running from, something inside him shifted. He couldn't ignore them. Not anymore. The siblings weren't just two strangers lost in the rain, they were two kids caught in the crossfire of something much larger than themselves. Marcus felt a surge of protectiveness he hadn't realized he was capable of. It wasn't just the soldier in him that responded, it was something more. He was no longer standing at the sidelines, he had become a part of their story. His thoughts were interrupted as the door to the clinic opened abruptly. Two uniformed officers stepped in, their heavy boots making a sharp sound against the tiled floor. The immediate shift in atmosphere was palpable. Ava stiffened, her eyes darting nervously from the officers to Marcus, as if she were already planning her next move. The officers, looking calm yet authoritative, quickly approached the nurse who was still checking on Leo. Their presence was enough to make Marcus's stomach tighten. His protective instincts flared up. He couldn't help but wonder, what would they do when they found out who Ava and Leo really were? Would they help? Or would they become part of the system that had failed them so many times before? "Everything all right here?" one officer asked, his eyes scanning the room, lingering on Marcus for just a moment before moving back to the nurse. Marcus stepped forward, positioning himself just slightly in front of Ava, his stance subtly defensive. He wasn't sure yet what exactly was going on, but he wasn't about to let these officers take control of a situation they didn't understand. Ava shot him a look, one of desperation and silent plea. She knew something was about to change, and she wasn't sure if Marcus was going to be able to protect them from it. For the first time since their encounter, Marcus realized how deeply he had become entangled in this. It wasn't just about offering a safe place for a girl and her brother anymore. It was about standing up to a force much larger than himself. He couldn't just walk away. He wouldn't. As the officer spoke with the nurse, Marcus felt a strange sense of responsibility settle over him. He had a new role now. No longer a passive bystander, he had become an active participant in this fragile moment. He had to keep them safe. "What's going on here?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying the weight of his new commitment. The officer glanced at him, sizing him up before answering with a simple, "Just routine questions." Marcus could see that this wasn't just routine. The tension in the room was rising. Ava's fear was almost tangible, and Leo, still unaware, clutched his sister's coat in his sleep. Marcus looked at Ava again, his resolve hardening. He didn't know what she was running from or why, but he knew one thing for sure: if the authorities were involved, things were about to get much worse for them. He glanced at the officers, his mind racing. They were here now, and there was no turning back. Whatever was about to unfold, Marcus realized that he had no choice but to stay by their side, whatever the cost. He couldn't let these children go through this alone. Not when they had already been through so much. Marcus knew he couldn't change their past, but just maybe he could help give them a future. The officers began asking questions, trying to gather information about the children's background, but Ava wasn't speaking. Every word she said was carefully measured, her answers clipped. She was protecting her brother, protecting herself. But Marcus could feel the tension in her. The fear that even a single wrong word might lead to disaster. The officer's arrival marked a turning point. Marcus's role in this story had gone from an accidental bystander to a protector, someone who now had a stake in what happened next. His instincts kicked in. He didn't know how he could help, but he knew he wouldn't back down. Not now. Ava's fear was his fear. Her brother's safety had become his responsibility, and Marcus wasn't about to let that slip away. He wasn't going to let them get lost in the system, to be caught in a battle they didn't understand. He would do whatever it took to make sure they were protected. It wasn't just about doing the right thing anymore, it was about doing the only thing that mattered. The story wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. But for Marcus, everything had changed. He wasn't just helping anymore, he was fighting for their survival. The moments that followed in the clinic were filled with tension and uncertainty, but as the hours passed, something in Marcus began to change. The rain outside had finally slowed, leaving a damp stillness that hung in the air. He sat in the small, sterile waiting area, his eyes focused on the siblings. Ava, exhausted and quiet, sat by her brother, her gaze flitting between Marcus and the officers, who were still asking questions. She was trying to hold it all together, but Marcus could see how much she was carrying, the weight of her fears pressing down on her. For the first time, Marcus felt a deep sense of responsibility that he hadn't anticipated. He had spent years running from emotional entanglements, believing that staying detached was the only way to survive. But the decision to step in that night had changed everything. It was no longer just about his quiet life, his safety, or his own solitude. Now, there was someone else to protect, to fight for. The clinic was buzzing with activity, but Marcus's mind was elsewhere, replaying every moment that had led him here. The sobs of the girl in the rain, the warmth in her eyes when she thanked him, the urgency in her voice when she spoke about her brother, they all swirled together in his mind. He had gone from a soldier who kept his distance from people to someone who couldn't walk away from a situation that called for compassion. For Marcus, the experience had opened a door he didn't know existed. The woman who had once been merely a passing stranger had now become a responsibility. He couldn't erase the weight of that knowledge. But it made him realize that maybe the world wasn't meant to be lived in isolation. Perhaps the only way to heal from the scars of the past was to open himself up to others, people who, like Ava and Leo, needed someone to lean on. As the officers finally took their leave, they left behind a lingering silence that filled the room. Ava and Marcus exchanged a glance, one of understanding. Marcus could see that her trust in him had grown. She hadn't fully opened up yet, but there was a shift in the air between them. Marcus had become more than just the man who had helped them out of the rain. He had become a protector, someone who had invested not just his time but a part of himself in their survival. Despite all the uncertainty surrounding them, Marcus made a decision. As the clinic staff prepared to send the children to a safer place, he couldn't help but wonder what would happen to them next. He knew they would need more than just medical care. They would need stability, a future that wasn't clouded by fear. Marcus wasn't sure how he could provide all of that, but he knew one thing: he wasn't going to let them slip through the cracks. Ava's eyes met his again, full of gratitude but still cautious. She hadn't yet fully opened up about her past, and Marcus knew there were many pieces to this story that were yet to be told. But as he sat there, he realized that whatever happened next, he couldn't turn his back on them. The decision wasn't just about saving them from the rain, it was about something deeper. It was about giving them a chance at a future that wasn't shaped by the fear of the past. Marcus had lived much of his life in the shadows of his own choices, but this was something he couldn't walk away from. He wasn't going to let their story end in the clinic. It was only just beginning. As the night drew to a close, Marcus stood up, his mind made up. He knew he had a long road ahead, filled with questions and obstacles, but for the first time in a long while, he felt something he hadn't in years: purpose. He had a responsibility now, not just to himself but to Ava and Leo. The fear, the uncertainty, the unknown, it didn't matter. What mattered was that they weren't alone anymore. Whatever came next, Marcus was ready. He had opened his heart to a future he never thought possible, and in doing so, he had found a path he could walk with the children. He had become a part of their story, and they had become a part of his. And that, he realized, was the beginning of something much bigger than he could have ever imagined. If this story touched you, and you want more heartfelt tales that capture life's hidden moments, please consider subscribing and sharing. Your support means everything and helps bring more stories like this to light.